is for, amongst other things, we are seeing some of the metals coming under pressure. Copper trade.
India's bid to ensure Jaish-e-Mohammed chief Masood Azhar makes it to the United Nations list of global terrorists has been blocked yet again. And once more, it's because China has used its veto power as a permanent member of the Security Council to block the move. China's official response is that it wants more time so that the committee can study the issue. India, of course, has hoped that after the Jaish-e-Mohammed claimed the terror strike in Pulwama that killed 44 Jawans, the organization's boss, Masood Azhar, would make it to the list of terrorists across the globe. China's move has also underlined once again a bigger problem that India faces, that when it wants to take on Pakistan, China perhaps is the one that needs to be worried about. To understand the implications of this development today, I'm joined by Bharat Karnad, who's a research professor for national security studies at the Center for Policy Research, Michael Kugelman, deputy director at the Asia program at Woodrow Wilson, and former High Commissioner to Pakistan, Sharat Sabharwal. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for speaking with us today on Primetime Debate. Mr. Karnad, I'm going to start by asking you whether we're surprised at all, because over the last couple of days, there were a lot of reports from sources again that China just may, this time round, not block the move. In light of what happened in Pulwama, in light of the statements they made after the Balakot strikes, that this time round could be different. Are you surprised at the outcome at all?
Not in the least. I think I've been saying all along that to expect China to do other than what it has done was extremely optimistic an assessment. The point, I think, is the claims that were made in the past few days leading up to the vote about the US and all the other countries prevailing their support for the Indian cause, prevailing on China, just reflects the kind of naivete we have about power politics. That's not how things work. Targeting Pakistan is in effect to target China because Pakistan is so centrally important to Beijing for it in pursuing its South Asian designs. Now this is what is not really understood. And it's not transactional either. There are geostrategic, values that are that is accorded Pakistan by Beijing, and that cannot be easily wished away by India. Now, we don't have any leverage with China except those that we don't want to exercise, and we haven't done so. I'm astonished that despite all the provocations over the years, and this kind of veto is just one of them, the Indian government seems time and again to hold back, to not respond in kind, to not go in for tit-for-tat measures. And then we end up squawking that, oh, well, China has betrayed us again or let us down and so on. It never let on that it was going to be on India's side. Yeah. So why do we now feel somehow dissatisfied with what China has done? This is what I mean by the extreme naivete and gullibility, in fact, in the Indian government. And that's really at the cause, at the center of our problems. We are extremely gullible and naive when it comes to dealing with China and in, shall we say, being a player on the global power politics stage.
Is it really gullibility, or is it a lack of options? If not, what are the options? Those are some of the questions we'll explore later in the show, but let Michael Kugelman...
No,
yes, Mr. Karnad, if you want to respond to that quickly. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, look, there are all kinds of options, for God's sake. I mean, you have the access of to the Indian market of to Chinese trade that we have so easily offered them and readily offered them, in the hope not that we'll be able to sell and export in the scale that China does to India, but in terms of expecting that the Chinese will respond with investment and whatnot in infrastructure, etc. That hasn't panned out, has it? We should begin using all kinds of methods that are available to us to stop the flow of Chinese goods into India. Why haven't we, for instance, done what all the other countries have done?
No, I'm just going to pause you there, sir, because I want to come to what options India has in a little more detail, a little further down into the show. But let me just get opening comments first from all of our panelists and different perspectives on it now. Mr. Kugelman, you track Pakistan, and part of that, of course, is the deep relationship now with China. In fact, China often refers to Pakistan as its iron brother. Mr. Karnad pointed out that this is not merely transactional in nature. Put that into perspective so that we can understand that when India talks about dealing with Pakistan, is it really China that India has to worry about?
Well, listen, I mean, there had been mounting pressure on China in this post-Pulwama environment to relent on this longstanding policy of blocking Azhar's designation. And, you know, China had also, as it builds out its Belt and Road Initiative, you know, it's had increased incentive to take a harder line, a stronger position on terrorism of all forms. And yet, despite those factors, the fact that it still did not relent and it stuck to the same policy that it's always had on the issue of the designation of Azhar, I mean, that suggests that it really is stubbornly wedded to Pakistan, and it simply wanted to signal its continued not alliance, but continued friendship, partnership with Pakistan. I think that's the bottom line here. And you know, it would have been a pretty low-cost move on China's part to actually step back and let the designation go ahead. It's not like Pakistan would have been unhappy. Pakistan needs China a lot more than China needs Pakistan. So there really would have been little to lose from Beijing's side to just step away and let this go, and it would have gotten some respect from the international community. It certainly would have gone down well in Washington. But the fact that China still didn't change its position, I mean, that suggests, as the previous panelist noted, that China is not going to be altered. It's not going to change its position, and that ultimately we should not be surprised that in the end it did just what it's always done.
You know, Sharad Sabharwal, that's a key point that Michael Kugelman makes, that it wouldn't have been that big a deal for China to step back at this point. It's not like Pakistan could say much about it. Is it a bigger message that China is sending India?
Well, you know, given the depth of the relationship between China and Pakistan, the fact that the Chinese are now deeply invested in Pakistan through the China-Pakistan economic corridor, given the position taken by them in the past, it wasn't altogether surprising that they took this position this time also, to put a technical hold. So I think that should be clear to us. It certainly conveys to us, first and foremost, the depth of this relationship, which has been growing over the years, which originated in their common animosity towards India and then has grown by leaps and bounds. And now it's a strategic relationship through this corridor. So that was to be expected. But let me also, to put things, keep things in perspective, let me say that it has been a symbolic loss, because the victory, had this move succeeded, would also have been largely symbolic. It wouldn't have made much of a difference, no difference at all, in my view, to the situation on the ground. Look at the number of groups operating out of Pakistan, terror groups, and the number of individuals that have been listed by this committee. And what is happening? They are collecting funds, they are operating bank accounts, they are traveling through the length and breadth of Pakistan to plan their moves, terror moves in the region. They are flushed with arms. It has made no difference whatsoever to that situation. Now, it has been important for us to secure the inclusion of all these individuals and groups on the list for whatever symbolic value and endorsement of the international community. But I think we should keep it at the back of our mind. I believe sometimes tend to think that we have expended too much of political capital on an issue and given China a sort of leverage and a feeling that it was giving or going to give us something very big in substantive terms. It would have been, as I said, a symbolic victory had we succeeded, and it is a symbolic loss. It is something which makes us very angry. It shows the insensitivity of China, but it's good to keep things in perspective.
No, that's important. I mean, that's a point that would have been raised today either way. If China had for once not blocked this, it would have been a huge diplomatic victory, but symbolic in that sense. Hafiz Saeed is on this list. What big difference has it made? But that's a different question, really, and this is why I want to come back to you, Mr. Bharat Karnad, on the question of what we can do. Now, there's a lot of talk about how India can punish China economically, considering the huge amount of trade between the two nations. In fact, there's a trade deficit in China's favor. And the fact is, Chinese goods flood not just Indian markets, but across the world. Our smartphones, our television sets, a plethora of them. So when you say India can and should hit back, what exactly can we do?
Well, look, most of the Chinese industry, as is well documented, is subsidized. When manufacturers and the manufacturing companies in China are given free power, free land, and free this and free that, free water, that's the kind of subsidy that's built into the Chinese costing structures. So what happens then? I mean, the point, I think, is there is a defense in even the WTO and the Doha round, etc., where you have a country that feels aggrieved with this kind of trade scheme that China pushes on other countries to hit back and say, no, we'll not allow the goods that are so subsidized to come to the country. We have all kinds of other means to do this. The other thing is Huawei. It's now monopolizing the Indian mobile telephony market. Now, why is that so? This despite many of us having said at the very beginning that Huawei is a PLA, virtually a PLA outfit, is financed by PLA. It does the PLA work. There are bugs in most Chinese Huawei devices, possibly, that can act as Trojan horses in a cyber war. So how come we did not stop the Huawei from coming into the market, having known its antecedents? So this is the kind of trap we fall into in trying to please countries that really do not but mean ill in every respect to India. We do this, I don't know for what reason. Did we really expect that President Xi Jinping will, just because he swings on a jhula in Gujarat, was suddenly going to befriend Modi and India and start diverting investment monies into India and do other things that India wants? It is going to push its interest to the in extremis. That's what it does. And it sticks by its interests. We don't. We think all vital interests, even vital national interests, are negotiable. That somehow we curry favor. I mean, what has China done in response to Modi's pleas to allow Indian IT companies to greater access to the Chinese market? Nothing. So this is the kind of stuff that we are stuck with, and we don't respond. See how they have inconvenienced, completely strategically discomfited India by nuclear missile arming Pakistan in the first place.
You know, everyone keeps
Terrorism
talking.
is a smaller problem.
Everyone keeps
They've
talking
created
about
far bigger strategic problems for India.
You know, yeah, and everyone keeps talking about that, you know, famous swing pictures of, you know, Modi and Xi Jinping in the swing. But so much has happened since then. Modi's visit to China, the Wuhan summit in the middle of that Doklam, and how we reacted to that. The fact is that if there was an economic backlash possible, it would have been done by now, and it was also attempted. India did attempt trade barriers. Nothing quite happened, did it, Mr. Karnad?
Well, look, no, I'm sorry. When you say you're giving too much of credit, in a sense, you know, unwarranted credit to India wanting to stick by the WTO and this and that rule and so on and so forth. The fact is, if your interests are hurt, you take ample measures to counter it. Whatever the Doha round, WTO, whatever. The Indian government seems wedded to the notions of multilateral treaties and agreements that end up not serving your interests. In that case, you act, no matter what happens. You don't, prevaricate and in any sense compromise with the national interest, which is what is at stake in dealing with China. This is not what, you cannot then say, well, this, that, and the other international multilateral agreement allows China to dump goods here in India. That's not the case. Why have the Chinese responded the way they have to the US? Because Trump has just slammed the door shut or has threatened to do so. And they have come online. Why don't we use access to the vast Indian market? Who else are the Chinese going to sell to? Nigeria or some other small country or big or small country in Africa or Latin America? India is the biggest market going after China. So it needs us. And yet we don't use the leverage, do we? We just succumb to whatever pressures China imposes on India. And then we end up looking like, like very weak-willed, a weak-willed government, a weak country led by a weak-willed government, and generally representing a weak people.
Michael, what do you make of these options that Mr. Karnad, who has studied China policy carefully for decades actually, he's made some of these observations. The huge market that India has. In fact, Trump's pressure on China is another factor that India can leverage in a sense. They clearly don't want another big market shutting down.
Well, it's true, as mentioned, that India does have retaliatory options, largely in the economic sphere, that it could well pursue if it chooses to. But the question is, when you sort of step back for a second, is you always have to pick your battles, and is this a battle worth picking, right? I mean, as I completely agree with what was mentioned earlier, that China's latest move at the UN, it revolves around symbolic matters more than anything else. That Masood Azhar is an old and sick militant who may be dead very soon. There really would not have been a major impact on the ground had China relented and let him get designated. My thinking is I think India could take the opportunity at a moment when there's growing support for India and its position on Pakistan-based terrorism. Why not try to work more with the international community to focus on other areas, other forums, to try to bring more pressure to bear on JEM and Masood Azhar, instead of just focusing on the fact that China didn't do what India would have liked it to do. Why not focus on other options? I mean, India likes to be seen as a responsible rising power, which I think it is for the most part. So instead of focusing on the reactive sort of retaliatory type thing, why not focus on other opportunities with an international community that, again, in this post-Pulwama era is really, in my view at least, increasingly on India's side in a very fervent way. I mean, you just see some of the resolutions that have come out of the UN in recent days. There's just a lot coming out there that suggests that, other than China, of course, and maybe a few other holdouts, the world really is behind India on its desire to figure out a way to get Pakistan to deal more about this relentless challenge of Pakistan-based terrorism.
So isolate Pakistan is already one strategy, isolate China as well, since there is this overwhelming support for India's move. Sharad Sabharwal, how workable is that? And, Bharat, Karnad has spoken again and again about how this government has dealt with China. I want you to give your view about the diplomatic strategy vis-a-vis China and the Modi government as well.
No, certainly going by this very insensitive move, there was an expectation that post-Pulwama they would be more sensitive to our concerns. It tells you that even where our vital interests are involved, this terrorism has been a major problem for us. China hasn't walked the talk. They repeatedly say that they are against terrorism in all forms, and yet again they have put a technical hold. But we were discussing earlier, trade by itself is an issue. There is a valid issue there. It's largely in China's favor. Our attempts over the years to balance it a little bit have not succeeded. The prices at which they sell, that's an issue by itself. There is the larger question of the relationship. Has the Wuhan spirit worked? Maybe it has not worked. That's a separate issue altogether. And this hold put by China this time is a reminder of those problems that we have to deal with. But again, I would go back to, it's a symbolic step. If it had succeeded, it would have been symbolic. The loss is symbolic. Now, because of that, do we go into retaliatory modes in a much larger way? As I said, which may be necessary, some steps in the context of the larger relationship. But that's something which we have to keep in mind. And that's why I said earlier, we need to keep things in perspective. Isolating Pakistan, I have said from day one, post-Pulwama, this term was used, is not possible. Other countries have their interests. China's deep interests, the Americans are working through them to cut a deal with the Taliban, the Saudis, UAE, other countries, Russia now, they all have their interests. So, they are not going to abandon Pakistan. But short of isolating, I think post-Pulwama, we could get sufficient support to put pressure on Pakistan. And I would agree that we have to work on those lines. China stands isolated. The only country which has been putting a hold time and again, that's visible to the whole world. The move was sponsored by a large number of countries. So let's continue to work with like-minded countries to put as much of heat as possible, as much of pressure as possible on Pakistan. You have the Financial Action Task Force, which is still considering Pakistan's case. It's coming up in May. Will probably the final decision would be taken in October. Can we work with like-minded countries to try and put Pakistan on the blacklist? They need a large bailout from IMF. Can we work with the like-minded countries to put some pressure from there? I think that is a route we should be taking. Other than that, look, China has its own concerns. It has concerns in Tibet. It has concerns in Xinjiang. There are symbolic moves. If they are not sensitive to your concerns, there are symbolic moves. I'm talking of symbolic moves, which you can make to convey a suitable signal to them.
Yeah,
I think that is the way to work.
Find the pressure points. Find the pressure points and, push on them.
That's right.
All right, we'll wait and see what responses come in from the government. The timing is again key. It is just a month away from the elections, a month odd away from the elections. National security has been a big issue, but then again, it's a different story when it's Pakistan. It's a different story when it's China. You have to figure out over time which really, at the end of it, is a tougher foe and a bigger threat. Thank you so much, Michael Kugelman, Sharat Sabharwal, and of course Bharat Karnad for joining us today on Primetime Debate.